Tonight, we have the grand pleasure of indulging in a 3-course feast of ideas with Gastropod. Hosted by Cynthia Graber and Nicola Twilley, Gastropod is the award-winning podcast that explores food with a side of history and science. Cynthia and Nikki issued their first episode in September 2014, and they've covered everything from whale poo ice cream to nut nappers. Those are kidnappers who kidnap nuts. And the awards have started rolling in. The International Association of Culinary Professionals awarded them Best Culinary Audio Series, and the Radio Television Digital News Association gave them the Regional Murrow Award for Best Online Documentary. Plus, Gastropod was included on multiple best-of lists, including Wired's 11 Best Scripted Podcasts. Every other week, Cynthia and Nikki offer a new episode full of fascinating and quirky details that we just love knowing. They are certainly making dinner parties everywhere much more interesting. It's a privilege for the Museum of Science to present tonight's program. It's their very first live podcast event. Yeah! And I'm thrilled to be able to announce that they will be with us again next season for another live event. So we hope you'll come back. But without further ado, I would like to introduce and hope you will help me give them a warm welcome, Cynthia Graber and Nicola Twilley.
Give us a second.
Can we have a slide? Yay!
There we go. So, how many of you have ever listened to Gastropod?
Woo!
Great.
Well, the good news is, after tonight, all of you will be able to raise your hands, because this is Gastropod, but live.
And if you have heard us before, this part's going to sound a little familiar. I'm Cynthia Graber.
And I'm Nicola Twilley. And, like I said, this is Gastropod, the podcast that looks at food through the lens of science and history.
We are thrilled to be with you here tonight at the Museum of Science. And as Lisa said, this is our very first live event. So you guys are going to be the ones to suffer through any mistakes we make.
But do not worry, we have snacks. The thing is, you cannot eat them right yet. You have to sit tight, keep your hands off the chocolate. You have to earn it.
Tonight, you are going to get to watch fungi and bacteria interact on a sliver of cheese as you eat it.
The cheese is alive! And you're eating it. As if that's not enough, we are going to introduce you to the new kale. It's kelp.
And we have a surprise guest who's going to tell us about the iconic flavor that is threatening ketchup's reign as America's favorite condiment.
And then finally, as a little take-home skill, we will instruct you in the fine art of music and chocolate pairing.
But first, we know that this is a scientifically literate crowd, and we thought you guys might be wondering why we named our show after a mollusk.
We are not only about snails, although we did visit America's only commercial snail farm for one episode. But the thing you guys have to understand is that naming a podcast is really hard.
You should have heard some of our early brainstorming sessions. We came up with some real winners. But when it comes to naming a show, there are a few things you need. It has to be easy to say. It has to be easy to remember. For us, it has to do with food and maybe podcasting.
So, Gastropod it is.
Huh. Where is It worked earlier. There we go. You know what that means? It's showtime.
Last spring, we devoted an entire episode to one of our favorite foods, cheese. An amazing excuse to indulge in lots of deliciousness and write off the expense.
You didn't have to eat the Velveeta.
One of my smarter moves.
In that episode, we took listeners back to the dawn of cheese and then went through 9,000 years of delicious dairy history.
Which we're gonna zip through in the next 10 seconds, so hold on tight.
But as we started the episode, we came up against a question. What is cheese? Surprisingly, it took an entire group of scientists to come up with a definition. It was only in 2014 and a special committee of the American Academy of Microbiology.
So, just so you know, cheese is officially dehydrated and aged milk.
Sounds delicious.
I know. Don't tell the French, right? That definition really lacks a certain je ne sais quoi. But what it does do is point to the fact that cheese is kind of a happy accident.
A long time ago, our ancestors had milk. And until they invented pottery, that's all they had. But once our Neolithic ancestors invented milk storage containers, then that milk could warm up in the Middle Eastern sun, and the sun-warmed milk could help the microbes get busy, and then the milk split into curds and whey, and next thing you know, cheese.
That first cheese was like a proto-ricotta, and it really caught on. Because now adults could eat it too. Cheese has about 80% less lactose than milk, so it opened up a whole world of dairy protein for grown-ups.
At the time, nearly all adults were likely lactose intolerant. They weren't drinking milk past childhood. But now they had this new wonder food, and they ate more and more of it, and their DNA adapted. And more adults became lactose tolerant.
Cheese literally changed Caucasian DNA, and in a really short amount of time.
That was a huge leap forward. The next huge leap forward, for cheese at least, that took place a few thousand years later in Europe.
The Middle Ages was a golden era of cheese innovation. All across Europe, people were experimenting with their dehydrated and aged milk, and cheese started taking on all sorts of new textures and flavors. You get the holes in Swiss, the blue veins in Roquefort, even the orange rind on Munster.
And what do all these delicious new flavors have in common?
Microbes!
Our favorite. Ben, come on up.
Ben Wolfe is assistant professor.
Ooh.
It's the microbes speaking to us.
It's the ghostly sound of microbes. Ben Wolfe is assistant professor of microbiology at Tufts University, where he has an unusually stinky lab. He starred in our cheese episode last spring.
Ben what he studies in the lab, among other things, are the microbial communities that live in cheese and throughout cheese rinds.
But first, it's cheese time. Take out the sample in the container labeled number 1.
I know you're all really excited about this.
Yeah.
I am. And I think this is going to smell almost as stinky as Ben's lab.
By the time we're done. Now, Ben, can you tell us what this cheese is?
So, what you are eating is called Moses Sleeper. So what you want to do is find the container that has a white, fluffy slice of cheese inside of it.
It's labeled number 1. It's Moses Sleeper, and it's a bloomy rind cheese.
So this is called a bloomy rind cheese. So what happens is the cheesemaker makes this dehydrated milk, and they age it. Exactly.
Don't eat all of it yet.
Exactly.
Save yourself a bite there.
And so what happens is during the aging process, they inoculate it with a mold. This is good mold, not like the bad mold that's rotting your bread at home, but mold that's intentionally added to the cheese. And during the aging, it blooms. It literally gets fuzzy and makes a delicious coat on the outside surface of the cheese.
Okay, so now comes the weird part. You are going to have the cheese in your mouth, and we are going to be looking at it live under the microscope. Ben made some slides earlier, and the things that you see there are the things that you're putting in your mouth.
So what we are looking at is this delightful mold right here. I think this might be the first time anyone's done this. So, but I've never lost a cheese lover. So here we go. So these strands that you're seeing, that's the mold. These are filaments magnified 1,000 times. So that fuzzy white sweater that Brie or Camembert wears, that is coming from all these tiny little threads that are there. And so as we cruise around, you'll occasionally see a tiny little fleck bobbing around. And those tiny little flecks, those are bacteria that are also living there with that network of fungi.
Okay, so you have this happening in your mouth right now, Ben. What has that got to do with the flavor?
It has a lot to do with the flavor. So if you ate a cheese that didn't have this mold growing on it, it would kind of just taste like yogurt. But what this fungus is doing, this network of fungi, is slowly rotting the cheese, and I like to call it delicious rot. So it's slowly decomposing all the components of milk and releasing some of those funky flavors that you're getting. So you're getting cooked cabbage flavors, you're getting some sort of sweet creaminess, and all that is coming from the action of these microbes that we're seeing live.
Okay, so everybody, finish up your decomposing milk. All good? Take out number 2.
So
And the second one, yeah, what is this?
number 2 is a really interesting cheese. So instead of actually putting a mold on the surface of this cheese, what happens is the cheese is repeatedly washed over and over again. Oh, there they are. Look at
them.
those guys.
That's pretty cool.
Yay.
Live
Wow.
Look,
bacterial
that's where you're
cargo.
at.
Look at them. They're flying around. These are our bacterial friends. So this washed-rind cheese, the reason it's sort of slimy on the surface and the reason that it has this sort of tackiness to it is as the cheese maker washes it over and over again. Oh man, they're doing so great. You guys are doing awesome.
They're performing for you.
I'm so proud of them. What's happening is they're selecting. They're actually growing these particular microbes. And the reason these microbes are swimming around is because they have tails. They can actually swim through the liquid surface.
So these microbes with their tails, how are they affecting the flavor that you're all getting?
So the reason that this room sort of smells like sweet buttery flatulence, love that.
What do you
yeah.
think about that?
It's a good kind of fart.
It's a good fart,
The
yeah.
sweet buttery.
The best kind of farts. Oh wow, they're really going at it. It's because of these guys. So when you go to the ocean, you know how you get that ocean funk? These are really close relatives to the same things that are producing the ocean funk. They're, again, decomposing the cheese, and they're making various sulfur compounds, just like the things that are in cabbage, and that's where you're getting some of those stinky flavors from.
Okay, that was really fun. But you know, I have to ask, I fully support eating cheese and loving cheese, but how did you get so into studying cheese?
Well, I was a cheese lover, and I was looking for a job, and a lab happened to be hiring someone that studied fungi and also was really interested in cheese. And the reason we're studying cheese, we love cheese just to sort of study it for the sake of being cheese, but we're trying to use it as a petri dish. We're trying to use it as a model system to understand the world around us that is microbial. The microbiomes that make up our bodies, that live in the soil, that drive all the things that happen on our planet.
And so what have you learned from cheese about these microbial interactions?
We've learned a lot of things. So one thing we're learning right now, that the smell that's filling up this room, that's actually microbial communication. The microbes are producing some of these flavors in order to detect their neighbors, in order to know who they're living next to and how to grow in response to their neighbors. We're also learning that some of those bacteria that we saw swimming around earlier, they can use these fungal networks, these highways, to cruise around the cheese surface in order to make themselves disperse in all kinds of different directions. So we're really learning, really going in and dissecting some of these interactions at a fine scale.
Fungal superhighways.
Fungal superhighways. Good name for a band, right?
I know, totally. Anyone?
I love it. But how is this research being used? Are you just sitting in the lab dreaming up new cheese flavors based on microbe fungi interactions?
Absolutely. You know, one of the big challenges that cheesemakers have is they're really engineers. They're trying to design these microbial communities that we just ate and that we were just looking at. And they don't have microscopes. They don't have the tools in their cheese cave. So we see things. We see cheeses that go awry. We see rinds that don't grow. And we can learn things to help the cheesemakers, to help them make more robust, more delicious cheeses.
He's like the patron saint of our local cheesemakers. So Ben, any hint about what's coming up next in your lab?
We're really excited about fermented tea or kombucha. So right now, Liz Landis, who prepared that second slide that we were able to see with all those bacteria swirling around, she's working really hard to pull the parts of kombucha apart, to pull the different members out of that system and understand how they fit together. And we're also really excited by the idea that as people make kombucha at home, you're evolving new kinds of microbes in your kitchen, in a jar. And we're using things like genome sequencing to go in and understand how evolution in a kitchen might work.
Thank you so much, Ben.
Absolutely, thank you.
Please give us a round of applause. And if you needed another reason to stay tuned, we are having Ben back on a future episode to talk all about his kombucha research.
So that is it for our cheese course, and now it's time for the main dish.
That's right. So we know you guys are all super ahead of the curve. Very thoughtful, very conscious eaters. So we wanted to go vegetarian for the main course. I hope that's all right with everyone. And you know, kale kale is a little 2013 at this point.
Kelp is the new kale. So until recently, you might have only seen kelp, wrapping sushi. But those vegetables that grow in the sea, they're good for a lot more than just wrapping rice. And forget about Asia entirely. Seaweed is actually a native New England food that we somehow forgot about. But not anymore, it's coming back.
That's right. New England is in the middle of a seaweed boom, and we visited its epicenter in Stamford, Connecticut. Charlie Yarish is fairy godfather to millions of tiny little kelp growing offshore from New York City to Maine.
So Charlie is an expert in seaweed biology, and he wanted to help New England fishermen grow kelp, and he wanted them to beat Asian seaweed farmers. He knew we couldn't compete on price, so he wanted to come up with a way to dramatically speed up the seaweed farming process.
Charlie turned his lab into a combination seaweed brothel and nursery. He starts by harvesting reproductive organs from wild seaweed and brings them back to the lab, puts them in an oversized beaker, and then he starts setting the mood.
He turns the lights down, the water's not too hot, not too cold, and the food is just perfect.
And then, most importantly, he puts the love tank on a wobble board and he recreates the motion of the ocean. And the kelp get it on. Cover your ears, children, that is the sound of seaweed sex.
Charlie gets those seaweed so happy that they're able to grow to the size that the fishermen are able to seed them back in the water in 1/3 the time it would take them in the wild. That is 2 months faster.
And Charlie is not stopping with just kelp. He has an entire lab full of different species of baby seaweed, and he's figuring out how to farm them all. Looks kind of like a lava lamp showroom. It's really pretty.
It is really pretty. Bren, will you come up and join us? So, Bren Smith is one of the beneficiaries of Charlie's seaweed magic. He runs a farm called Thimble Island Ocean Farm, and he runs a nonprofit called Greenwave.
Yep. And he just won the Buckminster Fuller Challenge Award for Ecological Design. Now, Bren does not sit in the lab watching seaweed having sex. He's out.
Damn it. Wrong job.
He's a clean-minded individual, and he's out in the ocean growing the kelp instead, and then processing it, and then getting it to the grocery stores or chefs. And then in his spare time, he is advising other would-be kelp farmers on how to get started.
Okay, so, Bren. It doesn't really seem like there's a very clear career path to seaweed farmer. How'd you get into kelp?
Well, first of all, it's as embarrassing as you can imagine. I mean, I grew up, beating seals and chasing tuna, and now I'm a freaking arugula farmer. I have to hang in totally different bars. It's awful. But so I was born and raised in Newfoundland. I dropped out of high school when I was 14 and headed out to sea. I fished the Grand Banks, Georges Banks, and ended up in the Bering Sea. And this was the height of industrial fishing. So we were tearing up entire ecosystems with our trawls. I've thrown tens of thousands of pounds of dead bycatch back in the sea. And most of the fish we were catching was going to McDonald's. So I was a kid, like 15, 16, working 30-hour shifts in one of the most destructive forms of food production on the planet, producing some of the lowest quality, unhealthy food on the planet. But while I was there, the cod stocks crashed when I was back home, and thousands of fishermen thrown out of work, and that was a real wake-up call for a whole generation of us, and it kind of created a split. The captains of industry, they just wanted to, they were thinking 10 years out, and they wanted to fish the last fish. We all wanted to die on our boats one day. We were thinking 50 years. And so we went on a search for sustainability. And I went to the aquaculture farms in northern Canada. Supposed to be the answer to overfishing. It was disgusting. Polluting local waterways, pesticides, antibiotics, everything we know. Now, we used to say on the farms, we're growing neither fish nor food. And in a way, what we did with aquaculture then was create these Iowa pig farms at sea. So I kept looking, and then eventually ended up in Long Island Sound. And the last little piece of this is I was an oyster farmer, which was kind of boring too. And did that for about 7 years. And then the storms hit. So Hurricane Irene, Hurricane Sandy came in, wiped out my farm 2 years in a row, 90% of crop, lost most of my gear. And that's when I had to completely rethink both who I was as a fisherman, who I was as a farmer, and what is it going to mean to grow food in the oceans in this new era of climate change.
So you have this really intriguing term to describe what you do, 3D farming. Can you tell us what a 3D farm looks like, how it works?
So imagine an underwater garden. So we have these chains on the side, our hurricane-proof anchors. And then parallel to the surface, we grow our kelp, and it grows vertically down. And next to the kelp, we've got lantern nets with scallops. And then mussels and these mussel socks also next. And then below, we have oyster cages that sit on the seafloor. And then down in the mud, we have our clams. And the whole idea is to try to figure out how many different kinds of species can we grow in 20 acres. But species that restore rather than deplete the environment.
And so this is what you see underwater. What are you seeing on the surface?
So I love it because there's nothing to see. It's like the worst tour in the world. I bring people out and they're like, and then we go home. But they pay $500. But so there's really not much to see, and that's a good thing. Our oceans are these beautiful, pristine places, and we need to keep them that way. Because we're underwater, anybody can fish, boat, swim on our farms. So we're protecting rather than privatizing our commons. And we have very small footprints. My farm used to be 100 acres, now it's down to 20 acres, and I grow way more food than ever before. We can produce about 250,000 shellfish and 10 to 30 tons of kelp per acre.
So you got into this and you wanted to do something that you thought was sustainable, and you just said you really wanted to restore the ocean. So how does kelp in particular, how does it help with that?
Well, it's this incredible agent of sustainability. I always say, you know, it's not my job to save the seas, but rather figure out how the seas can save us. Because kelp, Mother Nature developed thousands of years, millions of years ago, and it actually mitigates our harm. So it soaks up nitrogen, which is the cause of dead zones. It soaks up 5 times more carbon than land-based plants. It's called the sequoia of the sea. The New Yorker actually just recently called it the culinary equivalent of the electric car. And then our farms also function as artificial reef systems and storm surge protectors. So over 150 species come to hide, eat, and thrive because there's just all this stuff going on there. And this area used to be a barren patch of ocean, and now it's a thriving ecosystem. And then the last piece is we grow zero input food. So it requires no fresh water, no fertilizer, no feed, no arid land, making it hands down the most sustainable form of food production on the planet. And in the era of climate change, as water prices go up, feed prices, land prices, it's also going to be the most affordable food on the planet. We will be eating kelp, whether we like it or not, because it's zero input food. The question is it going to be beautiful and delicious, or is it going to be like being force-fed cod liver oil?
It's going to be beautiful.
Yeah.
So forget insects. This really sounds like the food of the future.
Boo, insects.
Deep fried, they're fine, but you know, kelp is better. But it's also sort of a rediscovery of the past. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of kelp in the Americas?
Yeah, so there's an entire Western culinary history of seaweeds that's completely forgotten, mainly because industrial food, it just changed our seafood plate and pushed everything off and, you know, just gave us cod and salmon and a couple fish. So Italians, 3 generations back, used to use seaweeds all the time in their cooking. There's the kelp highway all up and down South America, and in the digs they find people were eating all sorts of seaweeds back then. There's in Peru. I was just in Peru, and in the specialty restaurants they're all eating seaweeds. And I'm from Newfoundland. All of our crappy food was trucked in or boated in. The best vegetables around were seaweeds.
And so now I have to admit, I really want to taste this wonder food.
Cynthia always has to eat everything we report on.
Trouble is, it's disgusting.
So, Bren, really though, what does your seaweed taste like?
So, kelp is a great gateway drug to desushify seaweeds. And the reason is it's extremely mild tasting. Well, first when you cook it, you throw it in some water, and it turns this bright green, right, which is a great aesthetic experience for cooks. And then we turn it into noodles very often. And you get it has a very neutral flavor, so it sauces very well. And the mouthfeel, it keeps an al dente sort of slight crunch to it, which is really good. And that'll stay. You can freeze it up to 5 years, and you still get that great texture.
What are some dishes that you've seen chefs make with it?
Sure. So we're now working with chefs that don't do seafood, because this isn't seafood. This is a vegetable. Right, so you think of it wrapped around a piece of salmon, right? Or like in some miso soup. Brooks Headley in New York City, who used to be a punk rock musician and a 5-star pastry chef who doesn't know anything about seafood, made barbecue kelp noodles with breadcrumbs and parsnips. Delicious, right? It's a vegetable, right? So you come in a totally different way. We just did an event with Google, and it was a half beef, half kelp burger. And it both had that deep umami taste, but it also had the bright green stripes through it. And just as a side note, that we can feed cattle, chicken, goats kelp. They've been eating it actually for hundreds of years, again, before industrial food changed their appetites, their habits. And you get a 90% reduction in methane output, stunning. And you get this incredible, delicious, umami-packed, slightly salty beef. It's like a French salt marsh beef.
Wow. Kelp stops the farts.
Yeah.
So, we really wanted to have some of Bren's kelp here for you tonight to try, right? You want to try it after hearing that, but his last season's harvest is completely sold out already. But Bren, it's harvest season right now.
Yeah.
How's it going?
I smell like seaweed. I came in because I was on the boat this morning. Kelp is so fast growing that it's a nightmare. We seed it in November, which is past post-hurricane season, and then it's one of the fastest growing plants in the world. So we have 12, 15 foot plants, probably 40, 50 tons of it that need to come out in a really short period of time. So we have our processing plant going, and we're pulling day and night shifts.
It's amazing.
But we're getting 12-foot noodles. So we have this noodle machine that cuts it into noodles, and you get literally a 12-foot. So imagine like on a dish. It's like that Disney movie, It's like,
I'm hungry.
just one other thing is, this is about kelp, but it's not. I say kelp is a gateway drug because there are 10,000 edible plants in the sea. This is the beginning of like a 100-year journey of zero input foods. And imagine being a chef and realizing there are arugulas, spinaches, tomatoes, rice, corn that you've never seen and never tasted before. It's one of my chefs said it's daunting and exciting at the same time.
Thank you, Bren. I'm kind of blown away myself. So everybody, look out. Keep your eye out for seaweed in your local grocery stores and your local restaurants.
Yeah, try it and tell us what you think. So, one thing you will know if you listen to Gastropod, apart from the fact that Cynthia always wants to eat everything, is that she also always wants to put hot sauce on everything.
That's true too.
So, to keep Cynthia happy, and as a little extra treat for you all, we have a surprise guest tonight to supply a condiment course. Come on up, Sarah.
Sarah Lohman is a historical gastronomist in New York. She starred in our ice cream episode. She and Nikki made ice cream flavored with ambergris. That's whale poo, sort of.
It was surprisingly delicious. But Sarah's first book is called 8 Flavors. It's coming out in December, and in it she looks at the 8 flavors that unite American cuisine. But she's here tonight to talk to us about one of them, Sriracha.
Yes, this is my 8th flavor, my 8th chapter in my book.
So, Sarah, tell us about the origin story of Sriracha and the company behind it, Hoi Fong Foods.
Okay, great. So Sriracha, some of you might know, it was originally a Thai sauce that comes from the town of Sriracha. It's a port city, and it was created in the 1940s and made its way to Vietnam, where it became a topping for pho, or pho, depending on what you want to say. It doesn't matter. Or Sriracha or Sriracha. It's America. Say however you want. Nobody cares. And it ends up here in America through one man, David Tran. This is a young David Tran, back when he's living in Vietnam, just before the Vietnam War. His brother-in-law had a chili pepper farm, and the peppers were not selling well during the war. So he employs a classic agricultural technique of processing a food to make it last longer and make it more valuable. He takes those fresh chili peppers and he turns them into a hot sauce. This hot sauce apparently got very popular not only with the Vietnamese, but with the local American servicemen. Tran and his family ended up being refugees after the Vietnam War, along with hundreds of thousands of other Vietnamese people. And his family ended up in Boston in January of 1980. Imagine for a moment, if you will, traveling from Vietnam to Boston in January.
But you have to tell us the name of the boat he escaped on.
This is the boat that he escaped on. It's named Hoi Fong, which is the name of the company he would found by February 1980.
So the sauce is hot, but Boston is cold.
Yeah.
So David ends up in California, and he has a factory in Irwindale, which you have visited, right?
I have visited.
Can you tell us about it?
Absolutely. Basically, he told me that he called up his brother. His brother's family had gotten placed in LA, and he said, "Do they have hot peppers there?" And his brother said, "Yes." Packed up his family, got on a plane, goodbye Boston, and he said within a month he was making this hot sauce. And from the moment that he made it, he couldn't make enough. Sriracha sales have increased by 20% every single year, and they have never spent a penny on advertising.
Can you tell us about
This factory just opened up a couple years ago in Irwindale. It is massive, 650,000 square feet, and Sriracha is made from start to finish here. Everything, all the ingredients are local. There's only 7 ingredients in Sriracha. The first one, of course, being chili peppers. They're red jalapenos. Those are ripe jalapenos that we don't usually see in the grocery store. And they all come from one farm slightly north of LA called Underwood Family Farms. They make it from field to factory in under 4 hours. The growing season is from August until November. When they arrive at the factory, they get washed. The topsoil that gets washed off gets shipped back to the farm. It's very valuable in California. They get ground, which is what you're seeing here, and they get stored in blue plastic food-safe barrels. So by the end of November, they have enough of this chili mash to last the rest of the year. Basic chili mash is the chili peppers, plus salt, plus vinegar, plus a chemical to stave off the fungus and bacteria that you probably saw growing on the cheese. You don't want them in the hot sauce. And also another one to preserve the bright color. And then when it's processed into Sriracha, garlic is added. That comes from Gilroy. That's in California, and it's known as the garlic capital of the world. They add a little bit of sugar, too, and a little bit of xanthan gum, which is a thickener, too. That's it.
So, Sriracha, though, is now incredibly iconic. How did it get to be that way? There are Sriracha dishes in restaurants. There's Sriracha potato chips. Nikki and I just went on a road trip last week. We had Sriracha-flavored seaweed chips.
I know, it's so perfect. Such a perfect marriage. Okay, so how did this hot sauce become so popular? It's only been produced since 1980, and I feel like in the past 10 years, its rise is meteoric. First of all, Americans love spicy food. That's not a stereotype that I feel is normally applied to us, but we do. Because spicy food's addictive. You eat it, your brain releases endorphins. Endorphins feel good. It's your brain saying it's a panic response. But then when you're not actually hurt, when you're not actually on fire, you want to go back for more. It's like a roller coaster. So you like it and you eat spicier and spicier food. So that is a big part of it. But more than that, this is the perfect hot sauce for Americans. The texture, number one. It's thicker than previous American hot sauces. You think Tabasco, you think Frank's Red Hot, it's very watery. With Sriracha, you can really squirt it on there, engineer the perfect bite. And also, it's a lot less hot than most other hot sauces too. So that's not a bad thing. You're not weak if you like Sriracha. It means you get to use it more. It has more practical applications, and it appeals to a broader audience. And I think that little bit of sugar helps too. A little bit of sweetness really appeals to the American palate. So it's really those 3 things that has made it popular.
But then there are some steps that it had to go through to become really popular here. What happened?
So how does something like Sriracha go from being, it was intended for Vietnamese refugees. Tran thought they need something to put on their pho like back home, I'm going to supply it for them. So how does it go from there to, raise your hand if you've had Sriracha and clap. This is radio people. All right, great. Great. How is it that we have all had Sriracha even though we may not be Vietnamese? There's a company called the Center for Culinary Development. It's in California, and it's invented this 5-step system of how something goes to being an ethnic food product to being mainstream American. Its first stage is that it appears in high-end restaurants. A lot of times, too, especially with something like Sriracha, it was being used by the employees in the kitchen first in family meal on their own foods, and then it transitioned to being part of the food that goes out into the fancy dining room. It starts appearing in restaurant reviews circa 1997, so 17 years after it's first produced. The next step is that it appears in specialty food blogs or magazines, things like Bon Appetit. And Bon Appetit declared it Ingredient of the Year in 2010. From there, it goes to mainstream restaurants. Applebee's introduced its Sriracha glazed chicken, actually almost simultaneously in 2010 as that Bon Appetit article, so it was really going mainstream. From there, it ends up in magazines that aren't food focused. In, I think, 2012, Martha Stewart asked, "Have you tried Sriracha?" And then you know something is American when it is in Walmart. Walmart now sells Sriracha. It's like $2.13 a bottle, which is really, really, really cheap for Sriracha. And also Subway introduced a Sriracha mayo for one of its sandwiches. And that all happened about 2012, 2013, 14. So it is now an American ingredient.
So here's a weird question. Does David Tran eat his own hot sauce?
I got to sit down with David Tran to interview him, and I asked him, I said, "Do you eat Sriracha?" And he's a very dry, funny man. He said, "I put Sriracha on my Sriracha."
And how about you? How do you enjoy the rooster sauce?
I enjoy the rooster sauce, which, by the way, is his astrological symbol. It's a whole lot of sense. He designed the bottle, too. The man is a genius. I like it in a cocktail called the Spicy Zyg. It's named after its creator. It is about 2 ounces of vodka, about 1 ounce of vermouth, and then Sriracha to taste. Shake it up with some ice, pour it out, and I have to say it is a really, really delicious vodka martini.
Thank you, Sarah,
My
for
pleasure.
bringing the heat.
Thank you, everybody.
Like I said, Sarah's book, 8 Flavors, will be out in December, and do not panic. We will be having her back on the show to talk all about it.
Now it's time for dessert.
Finally. Humans have 5 senses, and we use all 5 when we interact with our food.
Smell is the most important. If you plug your nose, it's really hard to enjoy what you're eating.
Just think about when you have a really bad cold and food tastes like cardboard. But sight and touch, they're important too.
And this is radio, so what about sound? You might not know this if you missed our episode last summer, but sound actually has a surprisingly important impact on our dining.
Sound is really the forgotten flavor sense, but one man is on a mission to change that.
With science.
And potato chips.
Of course. Charles Spence is a professor of experimental psychology at Oxford University. We're going to take you back to one of his earliest food experiments back in 2004.
So this is a super neat experiment that hinges on the insight that one Pringle is essentially identical to the next. Pringles are kind of like the lab rat of potato chips. So what Charles did is he built a soundproof booth and recruited a bunch of volunteers, and he got them to bite into 200 Pringles, one after the other.
Okay, so the volunteers all have headphones on. And as they're eating, timed perfectly with each of their crunches, they hear one of 2 sounds. They either hear the crunches pumped up way up in volume, or they hear them muffled.
Now, remember, the entire point of this experiment is that Pringles are identical, but when the volunteers get out of the booth, they swear some of the Pringles are fresh and some are stale. The ones that they ate while the muffled sounds were playing, they tasted 15 to 20% less fresh.
Now, there is some take-home utility in this. If you have a bag of chips and you've left it around a little too long, just play some really extra loud crunching sounds and everything will be fine. Same trick actually works with apples, too.
Or if you are a particularly mean kind of person, you can do what Charles Spence calls the party version of this trick. Some colleagues of his in the Netherlands and Japan replicated his whole setup, Pringles, soundproof booth, volunteer, and they got the volunteers eating the Pringles in time to a metronome.
Okay, so the volunteers, once again, have headphones on. The first time they eat the chips, this is what they're hearing.
Crunch, crunch, crunch.
But the second time they ate the chips, this is what they heard.
Crunch, crunch, crunch.
And their jaws completely froze up.
And this has some take-home applicability too. If, for example, you are the kind of person who, once the bag of chips is open, you can't stop till you reach the bottom, not that I would know anything about that.
So, Nikki, next time you're over, if it looks like you're inhaling that bag of chips a little too quickly, I'm just gonna have some breaking glass sound queued up.
Whatever it takes. But Charles's experiments with food did not stop with the Pringle. He started thinking about the sound food makes before it goes in your mouth. Maybe that could set up a flavor expectation. One experiment he did, he found that people could tell the difference just based on the fizz alone between sparkling water, Prosecco, and high-end champagne.
So much as we'd have liked to have some Dom Perignon tap for you tonight, we're gonna leave you to try that one at home. But we do have another experiment we are gonna try with all of you right now. Charles thinks that you guys, we'll see how well you all do, he thinks you're gonna be able to tell the difference in temperature between the two liquids you're about to hear just based on the sound they make as they're being poured. So we're gonna play them both, and then we're gonna take a survey.
So do not shout out the answer, however excited you get. We're gonna play the sounds and then ask you. Okay, listen up. Here is liquid number 1 being poured. And here, liquid number 2. Okay, so this first sound again, this first liquid, stand up if you think it's hot. Okay, sit down. Stand up if you think it's cold.
Wow. Okay, so we're gonna try liquid number 2. So stand up if you think that one is hot. And if you think it's cold. Okay, everyone sit down.
I think we might have some cheating going on in this round
too.
But the good news is all of you were right. That first sound, that's the hot water being poured. The second one, that's cold.
The water changes viscosity as it changes temperature, and Charles says that difference is what you're hearing. Now, there's a party trick with this one too, and this is a little bit nicer.
Blindfold a friend or loved one. Play them the sound of the hot water being poured, and then serve them a freezing cold drink. They will be completely thrown for a loop.
Charles is working with some high-end chefs to bring this element of surprise into the restaurant. It's kind of fun to be shocked as you're eating.
But these are the sounds that food itself makes, right? The fizzing, the pouring, the crunching. And Charles started to wonder, what about the sounds that are going on in the background when you eat, like the music, whatever's playing? Does that affect flavor too?
So he came up with an experiment, and now we are going to do that experiment on you.
The wait is finally over. Time to take out piece of chocolate number 1. Number 1. We are going to play some music, and while it's playing, we want you to take a bite of the chocolate and really savor the flavor. Focus. So, okay, I'm going to wait till it quiets down. I'm going to cue up the music, and then you are just going to go into think about what's happening in your mouth. Okay? Go.
Okay, everyone finishing up chocolate number 1? Great, take out chocolate number 2. Now, same thing, we're gonna play the music. I'll wait till, all the rustling's over. You're gonna eat this second piece of chocolate and really think about the flavor and what it tastes like. Y'all ready? Okay.
Now, decision time. If you thought those two pieces of chocolate were different, stand up. If you thought they were identical, stay sitting.
Interesting. Everybody sit down. So as it happens, the two pieces of chocolate were identical, but they should have tasted different. Charles has found that playing high-pitched notes, that enhances the sweet flavors in food.
High-pitched music can make food taste 5 to 10% sweeter with no added sugar.
And those low notes, that can make food taste about 10% more bitter.
Charles has documented lots of these kinds of effects, but he doesn't really have a good explanation for why they work. They just do.
It might be something evolutionary. It might be a learned association that we pick up over time. There could be lots of reasons behind this. We're not exactly sure why, but these brain tricks do work.
And Charles's thing is, look, they exist, they work. Why not use them for good, not just for pranks?
For example, you could imagine a way to make hospital or airline food taste less bland.
Yeah, as it happens, Charles has created a custom soundtrack for one airline, sort of a sonic seasoning. But this has take-home applicability too. Next time you have people around for dinner, think about what's on your playlist as you're serving dessert.
That's the end of our first live show. Thank you guys so much for being here. We do have time to take questions for us and for our amazing guests, but first we have a few thanks.
Yes, first of all, huge, huge thanks to the Museum of Science in Boston for hosting us. Lisa Monrose and James Wetzel have been working behind the scenes for months to get this set up.
Thank you, of course, to, as I said, our amazing guests. We have Ben Wolfe and his assistant, Elizabeth Landis. We have Bren Smith, and we have Sarah Lohman.
Thank you also to the Cellars at Jasper Hill and Taza Chocolate for generously donating tonight's samples.
You can try them outside. This event was free, which is awesome, but as probably a lot of you do know, Gastropod also does rely on donations. So my mother, who is sitting right there, she generously agreed, she has the Gastropod t-shirt on. She generously agreed to staff a table outside where we have stickers, they're new. So if you've already made a donation to Gastropod before, you're welcome to go over and take one on our system. If you'd like to make a donation tonight, you can do that with her or make a pledge and take a sticker.
And now, guests, come on back up.
Question time.
Question time.
Us, them, whatever you want.
Yeah.
How much time do we have?
I don't know.
Great.
Next question over here.
Yeah, I'll let you guys do the questions because I can't see you all very well.
We kind of have to stand far apart because otherwise our mics will all yes, interfere with each other.
We can, if somebody needs to come into the spotlight to talk, you can.
Okay. Hi. I have a question for Bren Smith. Yeah, I'm over here.
Right over there.
Okay, so I'm taking marine biology this semester, and we actually talked a lot about what you presented on. And we also talked a lot about marine protected areas and how it needs to be a balance between large enough to protect the organisms but small enough to allow fishermen to get a good catch. And I was wondering what you thought was, like, what's the right way to find the perfect size where there are enough larvae and fish, like, leaving the protected area, but enough that are protected?
Absolutely. I mean, I'd actually come at it a little differently. So I say to a lot of the ocean conservationists that they're not environmentalists anymore, and I say that because you could set aside the entire ocean as a conservation zone, and it's still going to die, right? 1 out of 4 marine species are supposed to go extinct, right? Because of climate change. Unless you have engines of restoration in the ocean, you're not addressing the climate crisis, let alone food and food security and jobs and things like that. So my vision is what I call a Napa Valley of Merroir, where you have small-scale farms dotting our coastline, surrounded by conservation zones. We have seafood hubs embedded in poor communities that need the jobs, a hatchery, a ring of institutional buyers, the universities, the large companies, and then a ring of social entrepreneurs. And that's a reef, like I think of it as a green wave reef, and then you replicate that every 200 miles up and down your coast. There's also the possibility, and we're working on this, embedding our farms into wind farms. So why just harvest wind when you can do food, fuel, fertilizers in those same spaces and just use those small industrialized, well, not small, but more efficiently.
Am I allowed to ask a question?
Yes, of course.
I have a question for Ben. You said that aroma, as we opened our little containers, was microbial communication.
Yeah.
But what are the microbes trying to say?
So it's a great question. So we appreciate those aromas. We grow the microbes on the cheese to get those aromas. But it's interesting, if you go out into soil or if you go out into plant leaves, microbes living in those environments also produce these, they're called volatile compounds. And so what's happening in microbiology right now is we're beginning to learn that those volatile compounds are ways that microbes can know who's nearby. So for example, I love this story. In the ocean, a lot of the bacteria that colonize coral reefs that need to find particular corals where they need to live, they can smell the corals. The corals are actually producing compounds that they use to direct the way that they move through the water. What's really fascinating is the same compounds that those coral bacteria are detecting are found on that cheese you just ate, and some close relatives to those bacteria are living on the cheese. So we're finding in the lab that if you put a fungus on one petri dish, and even a few inches away you have the bacteria, you'll see them moving in the direction of those smells. And so there's some really, really interesting implications here. There's a lot of work happening also in cystic fibrosis, where people who have bacteria colonizing their lungs when they're really, really sick, those microbes are also making various volatile, stinky compounds that they're using during the infection process. So if we understand that communication, if we tap into those really smelly lines of communication, we might better understand things like disease as well.
I think that's crazy. Your cheese is not just alive, it's talking.
Right.
We have the next question right over here.
Hi, this question is for Bren. I really liked your presentation, and I found that map that you had with the seaweed and the scallops and the fish really interesting. But I was wondering if you could talk more about the seafood animals in that map. Like, what is the role they have in your farming? Do they interact with each other? Do they have some sort of role in the kelp farming?
This is besides the kelp and the shellfish, or also the shell.
You had that map earlier.
Yeah.
With the scallops.
Yeah.
And the.
Okay. Yeah. So all the the oysters filter up to 50 gallons of water a day, also pulling nitrogen out. Mussels actually have do a lot of carbon work, and it's a great lean protein packed full of omega-3s. So every one of them are their own agents of restoration, and we're actually trying to figure out what does the whole farm do as a whole. What's fascinating is we get different growth rates on one side of the farm to the other, and that means we're soaking up so much nitrogen that it's actually affecting growth. And that's a really good thing because we have way too much nitrogen in our ocean. And then all of our crops are also spawning, right? So what we try to do is under harvest and overproduce, so that all of our shellfish and all of our seaweeds are feeding the local reef system, and it gets bigger and larger and more productive, and we're only pulling out a small section in order to run our business.
Next question over here. So this question is for Sarah. I'm from California, and a couple of years ago, Sriracha was in the news because the neighbors were complaining about the spiciness in the air and coughing and whatnot. And I actually don't know what happened with that and if there was ever any actual evidence for that being true.
I was actually mentally preparing for this question because I get asked this question every time I talk about Sriracha, which is kind of sweet because everyone was really worried about what happened. And I have to admit, it's not something that I ended up covering in my book because I think this is just going to be kind of a blip that will eventually be forgotten too. So I mentioned they just moved to Irwindale. It was about 3 years ago. They took a major loan from the city at that point that Irwindale offered them. It's an industrial city. It has a population of about 20,000 at night and like 200,000 during the day because people are coming into work in this area. There's a lot of sort of cities in California that are like this, industrial cities. About a month after I was at the factory, that's when that all started, that neighbors were complaining. Interestingly, the first complaint was from the mayor's son. He lodged the first complaint. And there's something that happened the year before where Tran and his family, I don't know, they felt a little weird about the arrangement and they paid off that loan instantly. So Part of one of the things that was brought up in this whole matter was the city lost millions of dollars because the Tran family paid off that loan instantly. And there was a lot of back and forth about you need to make changes or we're going to shut the factory down. This happened during the chili grinding season in October when the allegations were that the ground chili was producing fumes that were irritating people's eyes. Again, I'd been there a month previous in the chili grinding season. The whole area around the factory smelled a little bit like burnt tires because it's industrial, but I actually didn't smell any of the sort of capsaicin fumes until I was in the chili room, which was in an internal room. There was a lot of back and forth. The city would make demands. Sriracha would try to meet those demands, but then the city wouldn't respond. There ended up being protests at City Hall for Irwindale. And then eventually, I believe it was the governor of California intervened and said to Irwindale, this really looks bad for California because the message you're sending is that California is not a good place to bring your business. And I actually think, and again, this is just my opinion, I'm not an investigative journalist, that Irwindale simply didn't expect such a big reaction. I think they thought this was a little hot sauce factory. We're gonna kind of bully them a little bit and no one's gonna care. And the opposite happened. The world united and panicked and bought Sriracha and stored it away and was following the news and is still asking about it years later. So after that intervention, then Irwindale put out some very clear demands about what they wanted the filtration system to look like. Sriracha did that, and then the next grinding season passed without incident. So we seem to be out of the water. The PS to that is that even though the factory is fine now and it's enormous, when I was there, they estimated that the demand for Sriracha would outgrow the capacity of this new factory within 10 years. So they have to figure out a way to expand. They probably won't build another factory because this one looks like, the last scene in the Raiders of the Lost Ark where it's just they put one box, you pan back. That's what the storage facilities look like for all that Sriracha. It's enormous. It's about 90% of the facility. So they have to build another factory or somewhere. They were getting offers from all over the country when that whole scandal was happening. The governor of Texas was we want you. You can make all the hot fumes you want. So there's a lot of Sriracha love, and again, David Tran is just this really amazing individual. And I guess I should say one more thing. If you want to see the factory, it is now open to the public. It happened during this whole incident. They wanted you to come be the judge, so that there wasn't any smell. And now that's continued, so you can go on the weekends and get a free tour, which I highly recommend.
Follow up. Yeah. Is he surprised by this unbelievable, not just success, but kind of obsession with his hot sauce?
I asked his daughter-in-law that question because the whole business is still family run, and she said that he just said, well, okay, I'll make this and we'll see what happens. And he doesn't concern himself with numbers and things like that in the morning. He just asks her, how's it going? Sales good? She says sales good, and then he gets in his golf cart and drives away. On the other hand, he, especially when Sriracha started getting really big about 3 years ago, he had a Google search for Sriracha. So every pair of Sriracha heels, every sort of parody video that came up, he would watch and love. And like I said, not only did he create this hot sauce, he designed that iconic bottle. He has custom designed every piece of machinery in that factory. When I was visiting, it was still getting up and running, and he was actually, when he was in his golf cart, he was going around and tinkering with these machines. And I assume that eventually he'll retire, but he also really seems to just love what he's doing. He's a very, very smart entrepreneur, although I think he's way too humble to admit it.
Our next question is back here.
Hi, I have a kelp question. So is are the kelp noodles mainstream, or is it only Grant shots and those chefs who are using them? Is this something that a regular person can go and buy?
Yeah. So our problem right now is, so I thought it was going to take forever to get people to eat this stuff, right? Really, I thought it would take 10 years, and the exact opposite happened. So our demand is through the roof. We don't have enough farmers. We could be, just in my area, we could be doing 1 to 3 million pounds of kelp. And we have, we've got over 150 restaurants that have put in orders, and then huge institutional buyers like the Unilevers, the Googles, things like that. And then all the universities and the elementary schools are really want it because because the way you attract kids now is good food, right? It wouldn't work with me, but so we don't even know we're selling out. Everything is pre-ordered. We're going to have some for sale on our website on greenwave.org at the end of this harvest season, so basically in about 3 weeks. All of that money goes back into Greenwave to train farmers. We got 14 farms coming online. I've got a 11th generation fisherman now growing kelp and being made fun of every day. So we're racing to solve that problem, and then the supply will catch up.
Soon.
Yeah, and look for our sea shine. We're developing kelp moonshine, which is going to be delicious. Still a fisherman. You know?
We have next question over here.
This question kind of piggybacks off of that in terms of just what you foresee in terms of growth, and then also you mentioned that you have a farm in Long Island Sound, I think, and where does it matter geographically where these farms are? Are there certain water conditions or depths that have to do with where you're going to put something, and then also how do you deal with the ocean conservation side of things, and how do you go about purchasing 20 acres of ocean to farm?
Yeah.
Thank you.
A lot of questions, which is great, but I dropped out of high school. One point everybody says, what about dirty water, right? And it's a great question. We have two kinds of farms. One, we grow in pristine waters, and shellfish and seaweeds grown in the U.S. are the most regulated food in the country. It's the most traceable. Our water is tested every week. We just have to because it's a live product. The oysters govern that regulatory regime. And that's a good thing. I mean, you wish your arugula was treated like our crops. But then we farm in polluted area. We actually do pollution farming. So in the Bronx and places like that, just to soak up heavy metals, just to soak up nitrogen and carbon, and that doesn't go into the food system. That can actually go into the biofuel system. The White House just hired a seaweed czar. Yeah, it's getting weird. It's getting weird out there. That can either not go in the food system or it can just stay in the water. Right? And our farmers should be rewarded for those ecosystem services. So what we're pulling out of the water, whether it's nitrogen trading or carbon trading, every other jerk is polluting. We're actually doing good things, and we should be rewarded for that. And I'll just say real quick on the leases. The leases are it's $25 an acre to own a lease. It's stunning, right? It's just with $20,000, 20 acres in a boat, you can start your own farm first year. That's why we won BFI, because it's cheap, it's replicable. I call it the nail salon model. Minimal inputs, minimal skills, and you suddenly have agency, and you can be a farmer. But you don't own your land. You own the right to grow shellfish and seaweed in that area. Anybody can do anything else. That's why they can boat, fish, you can commercially fish, you can lobster. We own the process, not the property. And that's so important in order to keep our oceans, the commons. We're not going to be people, building big, giant farms at sea and then blocking people out.
Hey, if this Gastropod thing doesn't work out...
We got a new job.
Yeah.
Great, and we'll have the final question right over here.
Final question. Oh, geez.
Better be a good one.
I don't know if it's good enough, because it's only for Sarah. And I'm just wondering, is the rise of Sriracha as a condiment, is that pushing other condiments out, or is it there's plenty of room for condiments? Who's losing?
There's a whole table. There's plenty of room for condiments in my heart. I can't speak for everyone. It's hard to say. In some ways, there's now been a hot sauce boom, which is a result of other things. Again, we've enjoyed spicier and spicier food. And my book goes chronologically. It starts with black pepper, and then we're eating things like curry and chili in the 19th century, and now here we are in Sriracha. So there's definitely been this trend from considering black pepper as being, ooh, spicy, to now Sriracha being pretty popular. So in one way, it's creating more hot sauces, but at the same time, it could end up being a Heinz ketchup. Because before Heinz came along, there were tons of ketchups. There was mushroom ketchup, there was walnut ketchup. They were actually based off of soy and fish sauces from Asia. So they were made from all sorts of crazy fermented stuff. And then tomato ketchup came along, and it had the right texture. It had a little bit of sweetness. It had a little bit of a sour, just like Sriracha does in the vinegar. And we, as American people, were like, well, I guess we're done with walnut ketchup now. Like, this is the one. So hot sauce in America is a 240 billion, a big business. And at least from what they're reporting, Sriracha makes up about a fifth of that currently. So they are really, and you can even see that other companies are a little bit scared because Tabasco releases own Sriracha. Like there are copycats, or let's not say copycat, let's say their own versions of this particular hot sauce. It's being fueled too by how we're changing as a country. We started here in New England, but now we're becoming much more Mexican, Central American, Caribbean, Southeast Asia. And so that is changing our food too. And I guess too, in closing, I just want to add that, speaking of entrepreneurship and how immigrants feed into that, someone who has immigrated to this country is twice as likely to start their own business as someone who is born here. So in all the debate that's happening, go ahead, applaud that, go on, do it. All the debate that's happening around immigration right now, not only immigrants but refugees, this makes our country, and I think more importantly, we would not have Sriracha if not for immigration. Take it to the polls.
All right, that is a wrap. We are going to stay and mingle a little bit. We want to make sure you all have time to hit that donation table. And then we are going to get ourselves over to Cafe Art Science and get ourselves a really stiff drink. And if any of you would like to join us there, we would love to hang out with you. It is at 650 Kendall, Cafe Art Science, about a 15-minute walk. I need that drink. And once again, a huge round of applause for our guests.
And we, as the Museum of Science, want to thank you ladies as well as you guys. This was fascinating and delicious. We can't wait to have you back. There are trash cans located outside each exit, so if you would help us by taking your bags and just dropping them in there, that would be great. And we invite you to get on our snail mail list for our print brochure that we mail only twice a year, as the best way to find out what's happening at the museum for adults, and that really groovy stuff like this will be coming your way. Thanks so much. Oh, and yes, you can sign up right there. There are people over there who will help you.
And donate to Gastropod.